Hello there, and welcome to my channel. I'm so glad you found your way here today. Today we sit with something almost everyone has wrestled with, and few of us fully understand. We tend to imagine forgiveness as something handed across a distance from the wronged to the one who wronged them, a generous gesture aimed outward. And before we begin, if these calm explorations are something you enjoy, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find their way here too. But look closer at what actually happens, and the direction reverses. Researchers who study forgiveness describe it first as an internal shift, a release that occurs inside the person doing the forgiving, often before the other party knows anything has changed. The one who forgives is the first and sometimes the only person to feel it. Picture someone setting down a bag they have carried so long they forgot it was heavy. Now let's begin. The gift, it turns out, lands first in the hand that gives it. There is a quiet honesty buried in the word itself. Long before forgiveness carried any spiritual or therapeutic weight, it lived in the plain language of debt and exchange. The old roots of the word, traced through early Germanic and Latin forms, point to the same simple act, to give up a claim to release what one is owed. A creditor crossing a name off a ledger, choosing not to collect. The original meaning of forgive was closer to cancelling a debt than to feeling warmly toward someone. That older sense still holds something useful. To forgive is not to declare the wrong acceptable nor to pretend the debt was never real. It is to stop standing at the door waiting for payment that may never come. The ledger stays accurate. The line item simply gets closed. There is a strange relief in seeing it this way, stripped of sentiment. You are not being asked to feel a particular way about anyone. You are being offered the option to stop collecting. Consider what happens in the body when an old grievance returns to mind. The wound itself may be years gone, the bruise long faded, the argument half forgotten in its details. Yet the body does not file these things away as past. When people in studies are asked to dwell on someone who hurt them, their physiology responds as if the threat were unfolding right now. The muscles tense. The breath shortens, and the stress hormones that prepare a body for danger begin to circulate. The grudge keeps the alarm ringing in a house where the fire went out long ago. This is the quiet cost few people tally. The person who wronged you may sleep peacefully tonight entirely unaware, while your own body rehearses the injury on their behalf. The harm becomes self-sustaining, no longer requiring the offender's presence at all. Something in us mistakes vigilance for protection. The body, meanwhile, simply pays. How long can a single moment keep its hold on a body? Longer than most of us would guess. In a series of careful experiments, researchers asked people to bring to mind a real betrayal or hurt, and to hold it there, then watched what the body did. The measurements were unambiguous. When people recall an unresolved offense and rehearse their resentment, their blood pressure climbs. Their heart works harder, and the strain registers on instruments in the room. The same people asked instead to imagine, understanding or releasing the offender showed those numbers settle. The wound, it seems, has a pulse of its own, and it borrows yours. What strikes me here is how the past keeps charging rent in the present. A grievance from a decade ago can lift your blood pressure in a laboratory this afternoon, as if the moment never agreed to stay in its own time. Have you ever felt an old slight rise in you, fresh and physical, as though it happened this morning? The body keeps a longer memory than we ask it to. There is a particular place in the brain where forgiveness seems to take shape, and its location tells us something. When people are studied in the act of forgiving, much of the work happens in the prefrontal cortex, the region just behind the forehead. This is the same territory the brain uses to imagine what another person is thinking, to model a mind that is not your own. Forgiveness draws on the machinery of empathy, the capacity to picture the world from behind someone else's eyes. That overlap is not a coincidence. To forgive almost always requires seeing the offender as a full person rather than a flat cause of pain, someone shaped by their own fears, history, and blindness. The brain cannot easily release what it has reduced to a villain. It needs the offender restored to human size first. This is why forgiveness feels like effort. It asks the most sophisticated part of the mind to do the hardest thing it knows, to hold another's perspective alongside your own pain and not let go of either. Here is a distinction that quietly frees a great many people once they hear it. We often fold two separate things into one word and then feel stuck. Forgiveness is something one person can do alone, an internal release of resentment. Reconciliation is something two people do together, the rebuilding of a relationship and the trust it rests on. You can forgive someone completely and still choose never to let them back into your life. The release does not oblige you to reopen the door. Many people delay forgiving for years because they believe it commits them to a reunion they do not want, with someone who has not earned their way back. It does not. You can lay down the resentment and keep the boundary firmly in place. One act tends your own peace. The other depends on whether the other person has changed. Separating them returns the choice to where it belongs entirely in your hands. Think about the people we sometimes most need to forgive. A parent long gone. A friend who died before the conversation could happen. Someone now far beyond any reach. If forgiveness depended on the other person receiving it, these cases would be hopeless. Yet people forgive the dead all the time, and they feel the change unmistakably. Therapists who work with grief see this regularly. A person sitting with an empty chair, finally releasing an anger the other will never know was released. Forgiveness can be completed entirely within one person, with no acknowledgement, no apology, and no living recipient. This is perhaps the clearest proof of what forgiveness actually is. It was never a transaction requiring two parties. The whole of it, the weight and the release, both, lived inside the one who carried it. The other person was never holding the other end of the rope. There is a strange mercy in that. The door you have been waiting at was never locked from the other side. It would be easy to assume that calming an anger and burying it amount to the same thing. They do not, and the body draws the line sharply between them. When a person merely suppresses anger, pushing it down while it still burns underneath, the physical strain continues. The heart and blood vessels stay under load, even as the face goes calm. Suppression hides the fire, without putting it out. Forgiveness works differently. When the anger is genuinely released rather than concealed, the cardiovascular system actually settles the strain, easing rather than going underground. The difference matters because so many of us mistake one for the other. We go quiet, we stop mentioning it, we tell ourselves we have moved on, while the resentment keeps smoldering out of sight and the body keeps paying for it. True release and a forced silence look almost identical from the outside. Inside, they could not be more different. One frees the heart, the other simply teaches it to ache quietly. Most feelings arrive and eventually fade on their own. Joy, fear, surprise, they come, they crest, they pass. The grudge is unusual. It is one of the rare emotional states a person actively maintains returning to it, deliberately replaying the offense, refreshing calming the anger so it does not weaken. People rehearse grievances the way an actor rehearses lines, going over the scene until it stays sharp and ready. We tend not to notice we are doing it. The replay feels involuntary, like the memory simply surfaces, when in truth we are reaching for it, polishing it, keeping it alive through repetition. Why would anyone tend a wound this carefully? Often because the grudge feels like justice held in reserve. A case kept ready in case the moment comes to present it. But the rehearsal has a cost the rehearser pays alone. Each replay deepens the groove, makes the anger easier to summon and harder to set down. The very effort meant to honor the wound is what keeps it from healing. We assume that going over a painful event repeatedly will gradually wear it down like water smoothing a stone. Often the opposite happens. Researchers who study rumination, the habit of turning a hurt over and over in the mind, find that brooding tends to keep a memory vivid and emotionally charged, rather than dulling it. Each return refreshes the detail. The wronged feel as though the injury happened recently, even when years have passed, because they have kept visiting it, and frequent visits leave footprints that look fresh. The mind mistakes familiarity for recency. A memory you revisit often feels close, not far, no matter what the calendar says. This is the quiet trap inside the belief that we must keep thinking about a wrong until we have fully processed it. Past a certain point, the thinking stops processing and starts preserving. The wound does not close, because we keep checking whether it has closed. Sometimes, the most healing thing is not to understand the hurt more deeply, but simply to stop reopening it. How quickly can a body register a change of heart? Faster than you might expect. In laboratory studies where people are guided to move from rehearsing a grievance toward genuinely releasing it, the shift shows up almost immediately on the instruments. Within moments of a person authentically letting go of an offense, the heart rate slows and the body begins to settle. The strain easing in close to real time. The mind decides, and the body answers without much delay. This tells us something about how near the relief actually is. We tend to imagine forgiveness as a long road, and over a lifetime it can be, yet the physical release can arrive in a single breath, once the inner stance truly turns. The body has been waiting for permission. What the studies cannot fake is the genuineness, and that is the catch. A performed release does nothing. The numbers stay high. Only the real shift moves them. The body in its plain honesty knows the difference between deciding to let go and merely wishing you could. Watch a very young child wronged by another, and you see something instructive. To the youngest children, a harm is a harm, and the question of whether it was meant barely registers. A broken toy is a broken toy the same, whether smashed in anger or knocked over by accident. Only later, as children develop the ability to read intention, to grasp that the same act can carry very different meanings, depending on what lay behind it, does anything resembling true forgiveness become possible. Forgiveness depends on understanding intention, and that understanding arrives gradually, somewhere in the early years, as a child learns that other minds hold reasons of their own. This developmental fact reveals what forgiveness is made of. It is not simply the fading of anger. It is a judgment about a mind, an assessment of what someone meant, and a decision to release them in light of it. The youngest among us cannot forgive, not because their hearts are colder, but because the act requires seeing into another person, and that sight takes years to grow. Step back far enough and a striking pattern appears. Across the great moral and spiritual traditions of the world, separated by oceans, centuries, and languages that share no common root, forgiveness keeps appearing near the center. The traditions of the East and the West, those built on many gods and those built on none, the philosophical schools and the religious ones, nearly all of them treat the release of grievance as essential to a life lived well, not as a rare or optional virtue. Cultures that agreed on almost nothing else arrived independently at the value of letting go. When unrelated peoples reach the same conclusion without consulting one another, it usually points to something deep in the shared human situation. We all wound each other. We all get wounded. And every society that endured long enough seems to have discovered that some mechanism for releasing those wounds was necessary for people to keep living alongside one another. Forgiveness in this light looks less like a moral luxury and more like something humanity could not do without. There is a reason a sincere apology can feel like a physical weight lifting. When someone who has been wronged receives a genuine apology, something measurable happens in the brain. The regions that handle threat and vigilance begin to quiet, and the brain's response to the offender softens, registering them as less of a danger. An apology received as real lowers the alarm the body had been holding. The words do work that the body can feel. This is part of why the absence of an apology can keep a wound so stubbornly open. The threat signal never gets its natural off switch, and the brain keeps the offender flagged as a hazard. Yet here lies something worth sitting with. Forgiveness can do this same quieting work even when the apology never comes. The release that an apology grants from the outside a person can sometimes grant themselves from within. The apology makes it easier. It was never the only door. Have you ever waited a long time for words that never arrived, not realizing you held another key? We carry a quiet conviction that getting even will feel sweet, that settling the score will bring relief. It is one of the most reliable miscalculations the human mind makes. When researchers let people take revenge and then measured how they actually felt, the results contradicted the expectation. People predict that revenge will satisfy them, and let them move on. Yet those who act on it tend to feel worse afterward and stay fixated on the offense longer, not shorter. The relief we are so sure of does not arrive. Picture the moment of imagined triumph, the cutting reply finally delivered, and then the strange hollowness that follows instead of the expected peace. The mind sold us a feeling it could not provide. Part of the reason is that revenge keeps the offender central, keeps the wound in active rotation, when what actually heals is letting the whole matter recede. We chase the satisfaction of evening the score and find too late that the scorekeeping itself was the burden. The win we wanted was never on that board. It seems almost backward, and yet the finding is consistent. We assume revenge closes a chapter, lets us finally put the offender down, and walk away. The research points the other way. In studies comparing those who retaliated against a wrong with those who did not, the avengers kept thinking about the person who wronged them longer. The act of getting even bound their attention more tightly to the offender rather than releasing it. Revenge meant to end the matter, extended it. The reason has a quiet logic. To take revenge, you must keep the offender vivid in your mind. Plan around them. Attend to their reaction. The whole project keeps them at the center of your attention. Letting go, by contrast, lets them recede. There is a hard truth folded into this. The grievance does not lose its grip when we strike back. It loosens when we stop holding on. The one who haunts us longest is often the one we tried hardest to repay. We might expect that the easiest person to forgive would be ourselves, the one whose reasons we know completely, whose inner struggle we witnessed from the inside. For most people, it is the opposite. Forgiving another person, even a serious offender, often comes more readily than releasing oneself from an old guilt. We extend a mercy to others that we withhold from ourselves. Something in us holds our own failures to a stricter account, replaying them with a harshness we would never aim at a friend. Part of this is that we cannot keep the proper distance from ourselves. With another person, we can eventually see them as one flawed human among many. With ourselves, the failure feels woven into who we fundamentally are, harder to set apart and release. Yet the cost of withholding self-forgiveness is just as real as any other grudge, and it is paid in the same currency, the constant low strain of carrying something unresolved. The mirror, it turns out, can hold the longest grudge of all. Two feelings often get blurred together, and telling them apart can change everything. Guilt and shame feel similar from the inside, both heavy, both turned inward, yet they do fundamentally different work. Guilt says I did something bad, and it points at an action, which means it leaves a door open. The action can be acknowledged, repaired, and released. Shame says I am bad, and it points at the whole self, leaving no door because there is no separating the person from the verdict. Guilt invites repair. Shame only condemns. This is why self-forgiveness so often stalls. A person trying to forgive themselves while caught in shame is trying to release a self they have judged irredeemable, which cannot be done from inside that judgment. The way through usually runs from shame back toward guilt, from I am unforgivable toward I did something I regret and can answer for. One of these feelings can be worked through. The other only deepens. Knowing which one you are holding is the beginning of being able to set it down. There is a kind of rest that stays just out of reach as long as a grievance is being guarded. Even when a person is sitting quietly, even when nothing is happening, a mind still defending an old injury keeps the body in a low state of readiness, muscles holding a faint tension, the nervous system declining to fully stand down. The body does not relax while the mind is braced. Part of you stays on watch, guarding a border the offender crossed long ago. You can see it in people who have carried a grievance for years, a held quality in the shoulders, a guardedness that has become their resting state. So familiar, they no longer feel it as tension at all. They have forgotten what it is to be fully unguarded. This is one of the hidden costs of the unforgiven wound. It does not only hurt when we think of it, it quietly taxes every moment in between, holding back a depth of rest the body cannot reach until the watch is finally called off. We like to imagine forgiveness as a clean turning point, a moment when something shifts and the matter is simply finished. Reality is gentler and slower than that. Those who study how people actually forgive describe it not as a single act but as a process that unfolds in stages over time with returns and relapses along the way. The old feeling rising again even after it seemed resolved. The decision to forgive can be made in a moment, but the forgiving itself moves at its own unhurried pace. This matters because so many people conclude they have failed at forgiveness when the anger returns. They decided to let go, and then weeks later, the resentment surfaces again, and they take it as proof that the forgiveness did not take. It is not proof of anything except that they are human, and the process is still underway. Forgiveness is renewable, chosen again, each time the feeling comes back, and the choosing gradually wears the resentment down. The return of the anger is not a failure. It is simply the next place to set the burden down again. There is a difference between writing to release a feeling and writing to understand it, and that difference shapes everything that follows. For decades, researchers have studied what happens when people put painful experiences into words on a page. The finding that emerged surprised even them. Simply venting, pouring out raw anger again and again, tends to keep the feeling churning. But writing that reaches toward meaning, that asks why it happened and what it revealed, loosens the hurt's hold in a way pure expression does not. The pen that explains heals more than the pen that complains. Picture two people at the same desk with the same wound, one filling pages with how unfair it all was, the other slowly working out what the experience taught them about themselves and others. Months later, the second tends to carry it more lightly. Something about turning a hurt into a story you can understand changes where it lives in you. It moves from an open wound to a closed chapter, still part of your history, no longer ruling your present. Have you ever written something down, only to find the writing itself had quietly changed how you felt about it? Forgiveness rarely begins with a decision to forgive. More often it begins somewhere further back, with a small and unbidden shift in how the offender appears in the mind. Researchers who trace the steps people take toward forgiveness find that empathy tends to come first. A moment of glimpsing the offender as a person under pressure, frightened or simply blind to the harm they caused. That glimpse opens a space that forgiveness can later fill. The understanding does not excuse anything. It only restores the offender to human scale, and from there, release becomes possible. Imagine learning years after a falling out some private detail of what the other person was enduring at the time, a loss, a fear, a struggle you never knew about. The wrong does not vanish, but something in your grip on it eases without your having decided anything. This is why forced forgiveness so often fails, while understanding so often works. The empathy comes first, and does the quiet groundwork, and the forgiveness follows almost on its own, arriving less as an act of will than as something the heart finally has room for. Consider where an unforgiven grievance tends to surface most insistently. Not in the busy daylight hours, but at night in the dark, when the distractions fall away and the mind is left alone with what it has been carrying. Researchers who study sleep have found a measurable link here. People who are more forgiving tend to sleep better, falling asleep more easily and resting more deeply, while those holding on to resentment more often lie awake, the grievance circulating in the quiet. The grudge keeps a kind of vigil that the body cannot share in. It makes a plain sense once you see it. Sleep requires a letting go, a willingness to be unguarded, and a mind still defending an old wound is not ready to be unguarded with anything. The same vigilance that the grudge demands by day refuses to switch off by night. There is a quiet irony in it. The resentment we keep partly to protect ourselves ends up stealing the rest we most need to recover. The wound stays awake, and keeps us awake with it long after everyone else has gone to sleep. Sometimes, what prolongs a hurt is not the hurt at all, but what we are waiting for afterward. A wound can begin to close on its own given time and distance, but the expectation of an apology holds it open, because waiting for the apology means keeping the whole matter active, checking again and again whether the words have come. The wait itself becomes a second wound, often outlasting the first. We tell ourselves we will be able to move on once they acknowledge what they did, and so we stand at the door waiting for a knock that may never sound. Meanwhile, the offender, who often does not even know an apology is expected, goes on with their life, and the only person held in place by the waiting is the one doing the waiting. The hard freedom hidden here is that the apology was never the thing that could release you. You can stop waiting before they ever arrive. You can close the door yourself, not because they earned it, but because standing at it forever was costing you a life lived facing forward. A persistent worry keeps people from forgiving. That to forgive is to forget to erase the wrong from memory and leave themselves open to it happening again. The worry rests on a confusion. Forgiveness and memory are handled by entirely different parts of the mind, and forgiving an act does nothing to erase the record of it. You can remember a wrong in full detail, every fact of it intact, and still have released the resentment that once came attached. The memory stays, the charge leaves. This is not only possible but common, and it is far healthier than the forgetting people imagine they are supposed to achieve. The lesson the wound taught remains available, the wisdom about who to trust and what to guard against, fully preserved. What changes is only that the memory no longer arrives with its old heat, no longer hijacks the body the moment it surfaces. To forgive is not to wipe the page. It is to keep the page and let it cool. You remember exactly what happened. You simply no longer have to relive it each time you do. There is a hidden cost to a grudge that has nothing to do with the offender and everything to do with what the grudge quietly crowds out. Resentment is demanding. It asks to be returned to, rehearsed, defended, and all of that takes up room in a mind that has only so much room to give. The attention spent guarding an old wound is attention not available for anything else. For the people in front of you, the work at hand, the ordinary pleasures passing by unnoticed, the grudge narrows the field of view. Think of how a single nagging worry can shrink an entire day around itself, how everything else seems to dim while the worry holds the foreground. A long-held resentment does this quietly and continuously year after year, draining attention from a life that is happening now. This is part of what people mean when they describe forgiveness as freeing. It is not only the easing of pain, it is the return of all the attention the grievance had been spending given back to a present that was waiting for it the whole time. Not every wound yields easily to the language of letting go, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. There are injuries so deep that the very suggestion of forgiveness can feel like a second insult, as though the enormity of what happened were being waved away. Those who work with survivors of grave harm have learned not to rush this. Forgiveness that skips over the full weight of an injury tends to be hollow, and naming an act as something that feels unforgivable is often a necessary stage rather than a refusal of the path. The honesty makes the eventual release real if it comes at all. There is a quiet respect in allowing that some things are genuinely hard, perhaps the hardest things a person ever faces. To insist on forgiveness before the hurt has been fully felt is to ask someone to forgive a wound they have not yet been allowed to have. The path, when it exists, usually runs through the injury, not around it. And for some, the work is not reaching forgiveness at all, but simply laying the demand for it gently down. It would seem that forgiveness is forgiveness, the same act whoever the offender happens to be. The mind does not treat it that way. Forgiving a stranger who wronged us once and forgiving someone woven into our daily life engage different concerns entirely because what is at stake differs so completely. With the stranger, the wound stands more or less alone. With the close one, the offense sits inside a long history and a future still unfolding, and the forgiveness has to account for all of it. Picture the difference between releasing your anger at a driver who cut you off, someone you will never see again, and releasing a grievance against a parent, a partner, a lifelong friend. The first asks little beyond letting it go. The second asks you to decide how to keep loving someone who hurt you, how to hold the wound and the bond at once. This is why forgiveness within close relationships is so much harder and so much more consequential. It is never just about the single act. It is about whether and how the relationship goes on, carrying what happened inside it. The urge to remember who wronged us, to keep a careful tally of debts owed and slights unanswered, can feel like a personal flaw. It is closer to an inheritance. Long before recorded history, the capacity to track who had cooperated and who had cheated was what allowed early humans to build trust beyond the immediate family. A creature that forgot every betrayal would be exploited endlessly, while one that remembered could choose its partners wisely. Scorekeeping, in this deep sense, was not pettiness, but a foundation of cooperation itself. We carry that ancient ledger still finely tuned to detect unfairness and reluctant to release a debt. Understanding this changes how we might regard our own grudges. They are not signs of a small heart, but the workings of a very old and very useful system doing exactly what it evolved to do. The trouble is that the system does not know when a debt has stopped being worth collecting. It keeps the tally running long past the point of any benefit, and learning to override it gently is part of what forgiveness asks of us. There is a strategy so simple that it can be stated in a sentence, yet it shaped the deep logic of human cooperation. Meet kindness with kindness, meet betrayal with betrayal, and otherwise start fresh. Studied closely by those who model how trust evolves, this kind of conditional response proved remarkably effective at building stable cooperation, rewarding the trustworthy and protecting against the exploitative. Something in us still runs on this ancient code. But the very feature that made it powerful, its readiness to answer a wrong with a wrong, is also what makes letting go feel like a violation of some deep rule. To forgive can feel like leaving a betrayal unanswered, and the old strategy protests, insisting the score must be settled to keep us safe. Here is what that ancient logic could not anticipate. It was built for repeated dealings with people we would meet again, where retaliation taught a lesson. Much of modern grievance involves wounds where no lesson will ever land, where the only person the unsettled score still binds is ourselves. Sometimes the wisest move is the one the old code forbids to simply stop playing. There is a pattern that researchers who study families have traced through time, and it is sobering to follow. Wounds that go unhealed tend not to stay with the person who first received them. The child shaped by a harsh parent often carries that harshness forward, passing a version of the same hurt to the next child in line who passes it forward again. Unresolved injury has a way of replicating itself down the generations, each link handing on what it was handed. Forgiveness, when it genuinely takes hold in one person, can break that chain. Picture a single person in a long line deciding that the hurt stops here, that what was done to them will not be done through them. The decision changes not only their own life, but the lives of people who do not yet exist, who will be met by something gentler, because one ancestor refused to pass the wound along. This is forgiveness at its most quietly powerful. It reaches forward in time, into rooms no one has entered yet, and changes what those rooms will hold. One release, and a whole inheritance is rewritten. The benefits of forgiveness are easy to imagine as immediate, a weight lifted, a sudden ease. The deeper effect is slower and quieter than that, and in some ways more remarkable. Researchers following people over long stretches of time find that those who tend toward forgiveness carry less anxiety overall, and that the gap widens as the years pass. The effect compounds, each released grievance leaving a little more room, the practice gradually reshaping a person's baseline. It is less a single relief than a slow change in the weather of a life. This makes sense once you consider what anxiety often feeds on: the accumulation of unresolved things, the open loops a mind keeps circling back to. Each unforgiven wound is one more open loop, one more thing the mind must keep partly attending to. Close enough of them over enough years, and the whole system grows quieter, less braced, less prone to the low hum of unease. The person who forgives habitually is not just easing single hurts. They are slowly building a calmer mind, one closed loop at a time, in a way that only becomes visible looking back across a span of years. We often imagine forgiveness as a response, something we extend only after the other person has come forward, acknowledged the wrong, and asked to be released. But forgiveness was never bound to a request. A person can forgive someone who has not apologized, who does not believe they did anything wrong, who has no idea forgiveness is even in question. The act lives entirely in the one who offers it, and it can proceed with or without the offender's participation. This is harder than it sounds, because something in us wants the offender to come to the door first, to earn the release by asking. Yet waiting for that request hands the offender control over our own peace, makes our freedom depend on their willingness to seek it. Many people never apologize, not from cruelty but from blindness, never grasping that they caused harm at all. To make our release conditional on their asking is to wait, sometimes forever, for a knock that may never come. Forgiveness offered freely, without waiting to be asked, is the version that returns the power to where it belongs, in the hands of the one doing the forgiving. Consider what it actually means to hold a grudge against someone day after day, year after year. The grievance does not sit quietly in storage. It asks to be returned, to replayed, kept current, and each return is a moment of attention given to the offender freely without their asking. Withholding forgiveness, far from punishing the offender, hands them a standing claim on the forgiver's mind, a place they continue to occupy long after they have left every other part of the forgiver's life. The one we refuse to release is precisely the one we cannot stop carrying. There is a strange reversal hidden in this. We hold the grudge, believing it keeps the offender at a distance, locked out, denied something they want. In truth, it keeps them close, installed in our thoughts, summoned again and again by our own refusal to let them go. Have you ever noticed how much time a single person you resent can quietly occupy, how they surface, uninvited in idle moments? The grudge does not banish them. It gives them a room in your mind and lets them stay rent-free for as long as you keep paying. There is a common belief that forgiving makes a person soft, that to release a wrong is to lack the strength to answer it. The truth runs the other way, and it takes only a moment of honest reflection to see it. Retaliation is the easy path, the one the body urges, the one that requires no restraint at all. Striking back is what anger wants by default. Forgiveness asks for something far harder. The command to hold that impulse, to override the immediate pull toward revenge, and to choose a slower and steadier response instead. It is the strong move, not the weak one. Picture the self-control it takes to absorb a real wrong and decline to pass it on, to feel the full heat of the urge to retaliate and set it down anyway. That is not weakness. That is among the most demanding acts of will a person can perform. The one who forgives is not the one who could not fight back. Very often, it is the one who could and chose not to, which is a different and quieter kind of strength entirely. We have spoken of the immediate physical cost of a single recalled grievance. There is a longer, deeper cost as well, one that accrues in those who hold resentment not occasionally but as a way of being. Researchers measuring the body's stress chemistry find that people who are chronically unforgiving tend to carry higher resting levels of the hormones the body releases under threat, as though the system never fully stands down. The grudge becomes not an event but a climate, a steady, low pressure the body lives inside. Over years this matters because those stress chemicals were designed for short bursts, for genuine emergencies, not for continuous low-level presence. Held too long, they wear on the body in ways that reach far beyond mood, touching sleep immunity, the heart itself. The unforgiving person is not only carrying an emotional burden, they are bathing their body slowly and continuously in the chemistry of alarm. This is one of the quieter arguments for forgiveness, made not in the language of virtue but in the plain language of the body. To release a grievance is in a real and measurable sense to let the body finally rest. Families have a shared atmosphere, a felt climate that everyone in them breathes, whether they name it or not. A long-held grievance between two members does not stay contained between those two. It seeps outward, coloring gatherings, shaping who sits where, who speaks to whom, a tension everyone learns to navigate without ever discussing it. And so when one person genuinely releases that grievance, the change is rarely private. The whole climate can shift, a held breath released across an entire family at once. Picture a holiday table where two people have not truly spoken in years, and the careful way everyone else has arranged themselves around that silence. Now picture the silence ending, and how the ease of it would ripple to every other person at the table, none of whom were party to the original wound. Forgiveness has this reach. Because we are bound to each other, the release of one bond loosens the strain on all the others nearby. One person sets something down, and a room full of people, sometimes a generation of them, breathes more freely. The act looks small and personal. Its effects are anything but. Some of the heaviest burdens a person carries are entirely invisible to everyone around them. A private failure, a moment of cowardice no one witnessed, a choice that harmed only oneself, a regret so quiet that not a single other person knows it exists. These wounds ask for forgiveness too, and they are among the loneliest to carry, precisely because no one else can see them or offer release. The self must forgive the self for things the world never knew happened. There is something both isolating and freeing in this. Isolating because no apology from anyone could ever reach these wounds. The only door is the inner one. Freeing because the release depends on no one else at all, requires no confession, no witness, no external pardon. A person alone in a room can set down a weight they have carried in total secret for decades. Have you ever held something against yourself that no one else even knew to forgive you for? The mercy you can offer yourself in private is real, and it is sometimes the only mercy a particular wound will ever receive. It costs nothing and waits only on you. We tend to assume the great challenges of forgiveness lie outside us, in the difficult people who wronged us and the grave offenses we struggle to release. Often the steepest climb is closer than that. For a great many people, the single hardest person to forgive is themselves, the figure in the mirror held to a standard no other person would ever be measured against. We grant others the grace of being flawed and human, while denying ourselves the same. Part of why this is so hard is that we cannot get away from ourselves. The offender and the offended live in the same body, and there is no distance to retreat to. The judge and the accused never leave the room, yet the cost of refusing self-forgiveness is as real as any other unhealed wound. The same steady drain, the same quiet strain carried into every new day. And the mercy we struggle so much to extend inward is the very mercy that lets a person move forward at all. The face in the mirror, it turns out, may be waiting longest of anyone for the release we find so easy to give to almost everyone else. A grudge is not a static thing tucked away in memory. It runs quietly and continuously in the background of a mind, consuming a steady current of attention to keep itself alive, to rehearse the offense, to maintain the case against the offender. All of that takes energy, and the energy is real, drawn from the same limited supply a person needs for everything else they care about. When the grudge is finally released, that current is freed, returned to a life that had been running on less than its full power without knowing it. People often describe the aftermath of forgiveness in exactly these terms: a sense of having more available, more room, more capacity, as though a tax they had paid so long they forgot it was a tax had suddenly been lifted. They feel lighter, but also somehow more present, more able. This is the mental energy coming back online, no longer diverted into maintaining an old wound. The grievance was costing more than pain. It was costing capacity. And what forgiveness gives back is not only peace, but power. The simple, recovered strength of a mind, no longer working against itself. A memory is not a fixed recording, sealed and unchanging once made. Each time we recall something, the brain briefly reopens. That memory holds it in a malleable state and then stores it again. And in that moment of reopening, the memory can be subtly altered before it settles back down. This is how forgiveness does some of its deepest work. When a person recalls an old wound while in a state of release rather than resentment, the memory gets laid back down with a little less of its original heat, and over many such recalls, the charge gradually fades. The facts of the memory stay intact. What changes is the feeling welded to them. This explains something people often notice but cannot account for: how an event that once made them shake with anger can, years after they have truly let it go, be recalled almost neutrally, like reading an old entry in someone else's diary. The wound did not get erased. It got rewritten slowly, each time it was touched by a calmer hand. The mind, it turns out, is always quietly editing its own past. And forgiveness is one of the few ways we get to guide the edits. There is a phrase people reach for again and again when they describe finally letting a grievance go, a sense that the offender had been living rent-free in their head, taking up space, surfacing uninvited, occupying thought after thought, without ever paying for the room. The decision to forgive for many is less about the offender's worth and more about evicting them, about reclaiming a mind that had been quietly colonized by someone who was no longer even present. The forgiveness is in a sense an act of taking back one's own interior. What makes this motivation so honest is that it is openly self-interested, and there is no shame in that. The person forgiving is not pretending to a saintly concern for the one who wronged them. They simply want their own thoughts back, their own quiet hours, uninterrupted by a face they are tired of seeing in the dark. Have you ever realized that someone you resent has been showing up in your mind far more than you ever invited them to? Forgiveness seen this way is not a gift to the offender at all. It is a quiet reclaiming of space that was always yours. Forgiveness is not a fixed trait, something a person either has or lacks. It behaves much more like a capacity that develops with use. Those who practice releasing small grievances, the daily friction of ordinary life, find that the larger releases come more readily over time. The practice building a kind of range. The capacity strengthens the way a muscle does, through repeated and unremarkable use, until what once felt impossible becomes merely difficult, and what was difficult becomes nearly automatic. This reframes forgiveness as something trainable rather than a matter of natural temperament. A person who believes they are simply not the forgiving type may have only never practiced, never built the range that makes it possible. And the practice need not begin with the hardest cases. It can begin small, with the minor slights, the careless words, the everyday irritations that we can choose to release rather than store. Each small release prepares the way for a larger one. The person who forgives easily is rarely born that way. They are more often someone who has quietly practiced day after ordinary day, until the muscle grew strong enough to carry the weight that once would have been too much. We tend to think of forgiveness as something reserved for the great wound summoned only when a serious wrong demands it. But several of the world's enduring traditions hold a different view entirely. In a number of contemplative and religious practices, forgiveness is woven into the rhythm of each day, a small and regular act performed before sleep, a nightly releasing of the day's accumulated grievances so that none of them are carried into tomorrow. Forgiveness in these traditions is not a rare ceremony, but a daily hygiene of the heart. There is real wisdom in this approach, and the science of grudges quietly supports it. Resentments left to accumulate compound, released daily. They never gather the weight that makes them so hard to lift later. The person who clears the small hurts each night never lets them harden into the kind of grievance that takes years to release. Imagine ending each day by setting down whatever small wrongs it handed you, refusing to carry any of them into your sleep or your tomorrow. It is a modest practice, almost humble, and yet, done faithfully, it may be one of the surest ways to keep a heart from slowly filling with stone. One fear holds many people back from forgiving. More than any other, the fear that to forgive is to approve, to signal that what happened was acceptable, even fine. If that were true, then forgiveness would be a betrayal of oneself, an erasure of the genuine wrong. But it is not true, and the distinction matters enormously. Forgiveness releases the resentment. It says nothing whatever about whether the act was acceptable. A person can hold with full clarity that what was done to them was wrong, was harmful, should never have happened, and still release the grievance attached to it. The two judgments are entirely separate. Keeping them separate is what protects the forgiver from the false choice between staying angry forever and pretending the wrong did not matter. You are allowed both to forgive and to maintain without flinching that the act was genuinely wrong. In fact, the clearest forgiveness usually rests on exactly this clarity, a full acknowledgement of the harm, paired with a decision to stop carrying its weight. To forgive is not to file the wrong under acceptable. It is to file it accurately under wrong, and then to set it down anyway. The decision to forgive and the felt relief of forgiveness do not always arrive together, and the gap between them confuses many people. A person may genuinely decide to release a grievance and feel almost nothing change in the moment, no flood of peace, no lifting of weight, leaving them to wonder whether the forgiveness took it all. And then sometimes weeks or months later, in an ordinary moment with no obvious cause, the relief simply arrives quiet and complete, long after the decision that earned it. The feeling, it seems, travels at its own pace, often well behind the will. This matters because so many people feeling nothing after deciding to forgive conclude they have failed and give up. But the decision was the real work. The feeling is the slow harvest that follows. Picture someone who chose months ago to let an old wound go, who felt no different at the time, and who notices one ordinary afternoon that the wound no longer aches when touched, without quite knowing when it stopped. That is forgiveness completing itself on its own schedule. The relief was always coming. It simply did not consult the calendar, and it rarely announces the day it intends to arrive. A grievance we believe we have kept entirely to ourselves, sealed away, affecting no one, is rarely as contained as we imagine. Resentment carried from an old wound shapes how a person enters every new relationship that follows, lowering their trust, raising their guard, priming them to expect the same harm from people who have done nothing to deserve the suspicion. The old wound, though private, quietly writes the terms of encounters it was never part of. The new person inherits a caution they did not earn. This is one of the more haunting costs of an unhealed grievance, that it does not stay in the past where we file it, but reaches forward into relationships not yet begun, narrowing them before they have a chance. A person betrayed once may guard against betrayal in everyone after, and in guarding deny themselves the very closeness they most want. Forgiveness in this light is partly an act of clearing the ground for what comes next, refusing to let an old wound tax every future bond. To release the past is, in a real sense, to give the future a fair chance to meet new people as themselves, rather than as suspects in a crime they never committed. We sometimes imagine that forgiveness to be real must be declared, spoken aloud to the offender, made into an event with words and witnesses. But the most genuine forgiveness is frequently silent, completed entirely within the forgiver, never announced to anyone at all. The offender may never know they were forgiven. The relationship may continue exactly as it was or may have ended long ago, and still the release is complete and real inside the one who offered it. Forgiveness does not require a ceremony or even a sentence. This silent quality is part of what makes forgiveness so freely available. It depends on no conversation that might go wrong, no confrontation the forgiver may dread, no cooperation from an offender who might refuse to take part. A person can forgive in total privacy on an ordinary day and tell no one and be no less free for the silence. There is even a kind of dignity in the quiet version, a forgiveness offered not for any credit or acknowledgement, but simply because the forgiver was ready to set the weight down. The release was never about being seen to release it. It was only ever about being free. There is a reason an old social wound, a betrayal, an exclusion, a cutting word, can still produce something that feels almost physical when recalled. When researchers watched the brain respond to social rejection, they found it lighting up regions closely tied to those that register physical pain, as though the brain barely distinguishes between a wound to the body and a wound to belonging. Being cast out to the brain registers as a kind of injury. This explains the strange bodily quality of old slights, the way a remembered humiliation can still make the chest tighten or the face flush years later, as if the hurt had a physical location. It was never only in your mind exactly. The brain filed it alongside genuine pain with much of the same machinery. And it tells us something about why these wounds are so hard to release, why we cannot simply reason our way past them. They are not merely thoughts to be corrected. They are something closer to injuries, to be healed. Forgiveness, then, is not talking yourself out of an overreaction. It is tending a real wound in the only place such wounds can finally close, which is within. There is an old consolation offered to anyone carrying a fresh hurt, that time heals all wounds that we need. Only wait, and the pain will fade on its own. It is gently untrue. Time by itself heals nothing. What matters is what a person does within that time, whether they work toward release or spend the years rehearsing the grievance and keeping it sharp. Two people can carry the same wound for the same number of years and arrive at completely different places, one freed, one still bleeding, depending entirely on how they spent the time. The clock was never the healer. This is worth knowing because the passive hope that time will do the work can become a way of avoiding the work altogether. A person waits and waits, and grows puzzled and bitter that the waiting changed nothing, never realizing that waiting was the wrong instrument. The wound needed tending, not merely outlasting. There is a harder truth here, but a more hopeful one as well. If time alone cannot heal you, then you were never at the mercy of the clock. The healing was always something you could begin in any year you chose, rather than something you could only wait to receive. There is a worry that hides beneath our reluctance to forgive ourselves, the quiet fear that self-forgiveness is a kind of letting ourselves off the hook, a way of dodging accountability for what we did. If forgiving yourself meant excusing yourself, then holding the guilt forever might seem like the more honest, more responsible path. But the research points the other way, and it overturns the assumption cleanly. People who manage to forgive themselves are actually more likely to take genuine responsibility for their wrongs, not less, more able to acknowledge what they did, make amends and change. The release does not weaken accountability. It makes accountability bearable enough to face. The reason becomes clear once you sit with it. A person trapped in unrelieved self-condemnation often cannot bear to look directly at what they did. The guilt is too crushing, so they look away, minimize, defend, avoid. Self-forgiveness, by easing that crushing weight, lets a person finally turn toward the wrong and own it fully, because owning it no longer means being destroyed by it. The shame that we imagine keeps us honest often does the opposite, driving us into denial to survive it. It is the forgiven self, paradoxically, that can afford to be fully honest. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to admit a fault once you have stopped hating yourself for it? Mercy, it turns out, is what makes accountability possible. A great many grudges are kept alive not by ongoing pain, but by a principle, a sense that to release the offender would be to grant them something they have not earned, to let them off the hook for what they did. So the wound is kept, tended, maintained, less out of suffering than out of a refusal to let the offender go unpunished. The grievance becomes a sentence we are serving on their behalf, a debt we insist on holding open because closing it feels like injustice. But look closely at who is actually held by this arrangement. The offender in most cases is entirely free, going about their life, unaware of the case still open against them, untouched by the punishment we believe we are administering. The only person bound by the unreleased grievance is the one tending it, the forgiver who has appointed themselves jailer and discovered too late that the cell holds only themselves. The hook we refuse to release the offender from turns out to be one we are hanging from ourselves. There is a hard freedom in recognizing this. The principle felt like justice, but it was never reaching the offender at all. Letting them off the hook in the end is mostly a matter of climbing off it yourself and walking away from a punishment that was only ever landing on you. At the heart of many wounds is not only pain, but powerlessness, the helpless feeling of having been done to, of having had no say in what happened, no ability to stop it. That powerlessness is often the part of a wrong that lingers longest, the sense of having been a passive object of someone else's choice. And here forgiveness does something quietly profound, something that has nothing to do with the offender. The decision to forgive is a decision the forgiver makes entirely on their own terms, an act of choice in a situation that once offered none. It returns agency to a person who felt they had lost it. This is one of the least obvious gifts of forgiveness, that it transforms the forgiver from someone things happen to into someone who acts, who decides, who shapes the outcome. The original wrong was not chosen, the release entirely is. In choosing to forgive a person, reclaims a power the offense had stripped from them, the simple but enormous power to determine how the story continues from here. The offender authored the injury, but the forgiver authors what the injury becomes. And that authorship is a form of strength the powerless moment seemed to deny them. To forgive is in part to take back the pen. There is a subtle illusion at the center of every long-held grudge, and it is worth naming plainly. Holding on to a grievance can feel like an act of control, like keeping a firm grip on a situation, refusing to let the offender escape consequence, staying vigilant and in command of what happened to us. The grip feels like power, but examine where the control actually lies, and it reverses. A person bound to an old wound is not controlling the past. They are being controlled by it, summoned back to it again and again. Their mood and attention dictated by an event and a person they cannot stop thinking about. The grudge that feels like holding on is closer to being held. The offender long gone from the scene still governs the forgiver's inner weather, still determines what surfaces in their quiet hours, and the forgiver mistakes this captivity for command. We imagine we are keeping the wound on a leash, when in truth, the wound has us on one. Forgiveness is what finally inverts the relationship, what takes back the control the grudge only pretended to offer. The release feels like loss, like surrender, like giving up a grip we worked hard to maintain. It is the opposite. It is the moment the past stops holding us, and we are finally actually free. The wish for an offender to suffer, to feel something of what they caused, can seem like a fixed feature of a wound, a hunger that will only be satisfied when justice is served, or never satisfied at all. We assume the desire for their suffering will burn until something extinguishes it from outside. But the research on forgiveness suggests something gentler and more hopeful. Once a person genuinely chooses to release a grievance, the desire for the offender to suffer tends to fade more quickly than they expected, often dissolving well before any external justice arrives. The hunger, it turns out, was being fed by the holding, and the holding was something the forgiver controlled all along. This matters because the wish for another's suffering is itself a heavy thing to carry, a low and corrosive presence that wears on the one who holds it as much as it ever touches its target. People rarely notice how much it costs them until it lifts, and when they make the choice to let it go, many are surprised to find how soon the wish quiets, how little it actually required the offender's punishment to release its grip. The appetite for revenge felt permanent. It was only being kept alive by the decision renewed each day not to let it go. Have you ever held a wish you assumed you would never be free of, only to find it loosen the moment you stopped feeding it? Most decisions are gambles, their value depending on how things turn out, on whether the other person responds as hoped, on whether circumstances cooperate. Forgiveness is unusual among human choices, in that its central benefit accrues to the one who makes it almost regardless of what the offender does, or whether anything changes externally at all. The offender may never know, never apologize, never alter their behavior, and still the forgiver receives the release, the easing, the reclaimed peace. The outcome that matters most happens inside the decider. This is a strange and freeing property when you sit with it. We are accustomed to weighing our choices by their external results, by what they get us in the world. But forgiveness pays out internally, in a currency the offender cannot withhold and circumstances cannot spoil. The release is yours the moment you genuinely make it independent of every variable you cannot control. There is a deep security in that. So much of life depends on factors beyond our reach, on how others act, on how things unfold. Forgiveness is one of the rare goods that does not. It hands the forgiver an outcome that no one else gets a vote, in a benefit that arrives simply because they chose it and stays, whether or not the world ever cooperates. Few decisions are so wholly within our own keeping. Among couples studied over long stretches of time, one quiet habit turns out to predict endurance more reliably than grand romantic gestures or shared interests, and it is easy to overlook. Couples who forgive the small offenses quickly, who release the minor slights and daily frictions rather than storing them, tend to stay together far longer than those who let small grievances accumulate. It is not the absence of conflict that holds a partnership together. Every couple has conflict. It is the steady, unremarkable willingness to let the little wrongs go before they harden. The danger to a long bond is rarely a single great offense. It is the slow accumulation, the unforgiven small things stacking up over years until the weight of them buries the affection underneath. Each minor grievance kept and added to the pile seems too small to matter on its own, and that is exactly why it is dangerous, slipping past notice until the pile is too high to clear. The couples who endure are not the ones who never get hurt. They are the ones who clear the small hurts continually, refusing to let them gather. There is a humble wisdom in this. The recognition that love is preserved less by the absence of wounds than by the daily unglamorous practice of not letting them collect. The relationship is saved again and again in the quiet act of letting the little things go. We tend to assume that a relationship damaged by a wound is, at best, restored to what it was, the break repaired, the bond returned to its previous condition. But those who study relationships have found something more surprising and more hopeful. A rupture that is genuinely repaired, worked through honestly and forgiven, can leave a bond stronger than it was before the break ever happened. The repair, adding something the unbroken bond never had. The relationship is not merely restored. It is in a sense deepened by having survived the wound. The reason has a quiet logic. A bond that has never been tested, does not yet know its own strength, has never proven it can hold weight, can withstand harm and recover. A bond that has ruptured and been repaired carries new knowledge. The lived evidence that it can break and mend, that the people in it can hurt each other and find their way back. That knowledge is itself a kind of security. A smoother bond never earns. This does not mean wounds should be sought, of course. No one needs to break a thing to strengthen it. But it does mean that a relationship which has been through a real rupture and come out the other side is not damaged goods. It may be the sturdier thing precisely because it once broke and held anyway. Some bonds are only fully trusted after they have been tested, and forgiveness is what allows the test to become a foundation. We have traced the cost of an unhealed grievance through the heart, the blood pressure, the stress hormones. The reach extends further still, into the body's defenses themselves. Researchers studying the relationship between chronic resentment and physical health have found that sustained unforgiveness is correlated with a weaker immune response. The body's capacity to defend itself measurably diminished under the steady stress that a long-held grievance maintains. The grudge does not only wear on the mind, it quietly lowers the body's guard against the world. The mechanism is not mysterious. The stress chemistry that a chronic grievance keeps elevated was never meant to run continuously and held high for too long. It suppresses the very systems that protect us, diverting resources the body needs to defend itself. A person locked in long-term resentment is in a real physiological sense more exposed, their defenses thinned by a fight that exists mostly in memory. This is one of the more sobering findings in the science of forgiveness, because it shows how completely the mind and body are joined. How a wound we think of as purely emotional reaches all the way down into our physical resilience. To carry a grudge for years is not only to suffer it, it is in a quiet and measurable way to leave oneself less defended against everything else. The body pays for the grievance in a currency we do not usually think to count, and forgiveness, in releasing the grievance, returns something the body needed all along. There is a particular sorrow folded into certain acts of forgiveness, one that surprises people who expected only relief. To forgive some old wounds, a person has to let go not only of the grievance, but of the apology they always hoped would come, the acknowledgement they waited years to receive, the moment where the offender finally understood and said so. Forgiving means accepting that this moment will never arrive, and that acceptance carries a genuine grief, a mourning for the repair that was longed for and will not happen. The forgiveness and the grief arrive together. This is why some forgiveness feels less like a release and more like a loss, at least at first. The person is giving up something real, a hope they carried a long time, the cherished possibility that one day the wrong would be named and set right by the one who caused it. Letting go of the grievance also means letting go of that hope, and the letting go of hope always grieves. But there is something on the other side of that grief worth reaching. The hope for the apology, however precious, was a tether to the offender, a way of remaining bound to them by waiting. To grieve it and release it is to finally come untied, to stop organizing one's inner life around a moment that was never going to come. The apology never arrived. But the freedom can, once the waiting for it is finally laid to rest. A wound is not only what happened, it is also the story we tell ourselves about what happened, the account of why it occurred, what it meant, who we became because of it. And that story, unlike the event, is not fixed. Those who study how people heal from hurt have found that the narrative a person holds about a wrong can be revised, reframed, retold from a different angle. And that when the story changes, the feeling attached to it changes with it. The facts stay the same. The meaning, which is where the pain actually lives, can move. Consider how differently the same event can sit depending on the story wrapped around it. A betrayal told as proof that one is unlovable lands far heavier than the same betrayal told as evidence of another person's limitation. The event did not change between those two tellings. Only the story did. And yet the weight is entirely different. This is not a trick or a denial. It is a recognition that much of a wound's power comes from the interpretation we have built around it, often without choosing to, often years ago when we understood far less. To revise the story honestly, and from where we stand now, is one of the quiet ways forgiveness actually works. We are not changing what happened. We are changing what it is allowed to mean. How we categorize the person who wronged us shapes more than almost anything else whether we can release them. Researchers studying forgiveness have noticed a clear pattern in who forgives more easily, and it turns on a single distinction. People who come to see an offender as flawed, as a limited and struggling human being who failed, forgive far more readily than those who see the offender as simply evil, as a creature of pure malice. The difference is not in the offense, but in how the offender is understood. The reason is almost structural. Evil is a closed category. There is nowhere to go with it, no release possible, because a wholly evil person has placed themselves beyond reach. But a flawed person is one of us, subject to the same fears and blindnesses and failures that touch everyone. And that recognition opens a door. We can release a flawed human in a way we can never release a monster, because the flawed human is still inside the circle of the forgivable. This does not mean excusing the harm or pretending it was small. It means resisting the temptation to inflate the offender into something inhuman, which feels like justice, but quietly seals off the only path to our own freedom. Seeing them at human size does not let them off. It lets us out. There is a fear that forgiving an old wound means losing what the wound taught us, surrendering the hard-won wisdom about who to trust, what to guard against, how the world can hurt us. If forgiveness erased that knowledge, it might genuinely be unwise, a kind of willful forgetting that leaves us exposed to the same harm again. But forgiveness does no such thing. It keeps the lesson fully intact while releasing only the ache, separating the wisdom the wound carried from the pain it also carried. You get to remain wiser without remaining wounded. This is one of the most reassuring truths in the whole subject, because it dissolves the false choice it seemed to pose. We imagine we must either stay hurt in order to stay smart, or heal at the cost of our hard-earned caution. Neither is necessary. The knowledge and the pain were never the same thing, even though they arrived together. A person can know exactly what a betrayal taught them about a certain kind of person, can carry that lesson forward and act on it wisely, and still have released the resentment that once came welded to it. The lesson stays useful. The ache simply stops being required to keep it. Forgiveness, properly understood, is not the loss of what the wound taught. It is the keeping of the wisdom and the laying down of the weight, which is the best of both. Forgiveness leaves no visible trace. A person can release a grievance they have carried for 30 years, while sitting quietly in a chair, and nothing in the room changes, nothing an observer could point to, no outward sign that anything at all has happened. From the outside, the moment of forgiveness looks like nothing. And yet inside, it can be one of the most significant rearrangements a person ever undergoes. A quiet reordering of their entire inner landscape, the relocation of something heavy that touched everything. The whole interior shifts and the world sees none of it. There is something quietly moving in this hiddenness. The largest acts of a human life are often the ones no one witnesses, performed in private, registered nowhere but within. A person walks into a room carrying a grievance and walks out without it, and the people they pass have no idea they have just watched someone set down a weight they bore for decades. Have you ever made a decision so internal that no one around you could possibly have known your life had just turned? Forgiveness is frequently such a decision. It asks for no audience and leaves no mark on the visible world, and yet for the one who makes it almost nothing afterward is quite the same. The most important room a person ever rearranges is the one no one else can see inside. Anger is not the enemy, and it is worth saying so plainly. In its early moment, anger does important work, signaling that a boundary has been crossed, that something is wrong, that a harm has occurred, and demands attention. That signal is valuable. A person who could feel no anger at being wronged would be dangerously unprotected. But anger is built to be a signal, a brief alarm, not a permanent condition, and rehearsed too long past its purpose, it curdles into something that no longer serves. The alarm was meant to ring and then stop. The trouble comes when we keep it ringing. There is a clean wisdom in distinguishing the anger that informs from the anger that we maintain. The first rises on its own, tells us something true, and would fade if we let it. The second is kept alive, deliberately rehearsed, and refreshed long after its message has been received and understood, until it stops protecting us and starts simply burning. Forgiveness is not the rejection of anger then. It is the release of anger that has outlived its function, that has said everything it had to say, and now only damages the one who holds it. Honor the early signal. It is real, and it matters. But there comes a point where the anger has done its work, and holding it past that point protects nothing. Knowing where that point lies and being willing to let go once it passes is much of what forgiveness asks. A persistent confusion holds that to forgive someone is to lower the guard against them, to open the door again, to become vulnerable to the same harm a second time. Under that belief, forgiveness looks reckless, a naive invitation to be hurt anew. But forgiveness and boundaries are not opposed. They live together comfortably. And the healthiest forgiveness frequently depends on firm boundaries rather than the absence of them. A person can fully release their resentment toward someone and still decline to give that someone any further access to their life. The release is internal. The boundary is external. Neither requires the other to bend. This pairing is what makes forgiveness safe. And it dissolves the fear that holds so many people back. You are not choosing between staying angry to protect yourself and forgiving to expose yourself. You can do both, releasing the grievance while keeping the wall exactly where it needs to be. In fact, a clear boundary often makes forgiveness possible because it removes the need to stay angry as a form of self-protection. The anger was doing the work of the wall. Build the wall properly and the anger is no longer needed for the job. Forgive the person fully, and let them know closer than is wise. The forgiveness frees your inner world. The boundary guards your outer one. Together they let you release the past without becoming careless about the future. There is an image worth holding on to when thinking about an unreleased grudge. The person who cannot forgive is tied to the one who wronged them, joined by an invisible cord that no amount of distance can stretch thin, dragging the offender along through every part of their life, into rooms the offender will never see. Years after any real contact has ended, the grudge is a tether, and the one who holds it is bound as surely as the one it binds, perhaps more so. We imagine that refusing to forgive keeps the offender at a distance, pushed away, held off. The cord tells a different story. To keep a grievance is to keep the connection, to remain attached to the very person we most wish to be free of hauling them with us wherever we go. The offender often has cut their end of the cord long ago and walked away unburdened. Only the forgiver still holds theirs, still feels the weight on the other end. Forgiveness is the cutting of that cord. It is not a gift handed across the distance to the offender, who in most cases is no longer even looking. It is a release of one's own end, a letting go that frees the forgiver to walk forward unattached, no longer dragging behind them a person they stopped wanting in their life long ago. The cord was never holding the offender close. It was only ever holding the forgiver back. There is a kind of forgiveness that fails precisely because it comes too soon. A person eager to be done with a painful feeling rushes to forgive before they have allowed themselves to feel the wound at all, declaring the matter released while the hurt underneath remains unacknowledged. This premature forgiveness rarely holds. It sits on the surface while the unfelt pain continues working below. And sooner or later the grievance resurfaces, having never truly been released, because it was never truly faced. The quick forgiveness was a way of skipping the wound, not healing it. The reason lies in what forgiveness actually requires. You cannot release a hurt you have not let yourself have. To forgive genuinely, a person has to first acknowledge the full weight of what happened. To feel it rather than rush past it. Because the release is only meaningful once there is something real to release. Forgiveness offered before the hurt is felt is forgiveness of nothing, a gesture aimed at a wound the person has not yet allowed themselves to register. This is why the path to lasting forgiveness so often runs uncomfortably through the pain rather than around it. The instinct to leap straight to release, to skip the hard middle, is understandable, but it tends to produce a forgiveness that does not last. The wound must be felt before it can be freed. The way out is through. Building on this, there is a shape that real forgiveness tends to take, and it is not the shortcut we would prefer. Genuine forgiveness usually moves through the full weight of the injury rather than around it, requiring the person to feel the complete measure of what was lost, what was harmed, what was taken before any lasting release becomes possible. The path runs directly through the heaviest part of the wound, not along an easier route that skirts it. There is no version of deep forgiveness that does not pass through the depth of the hurt first. This is hard to accept because everything in us wants to avoid the heaviest part, to find a way to set the burden down without first lifting its full weight. But forgiveness does not work by avoidance. The person who tries to release a wound without feeling it finds the release does not take, because they were releasing something they had not yet truly grasped. Only by feeling the full weight, by letting the injury be as large as it actually was, does a person reach the place where genuine release can happen. There is a strange mercy in this difficult truth. The pain is not an obstacle to the forgiveness. It is the road to it. To feel the wound fully is not to be defeated by it, but to begin finally the only process that can truly free you from it. The way through is the way, and there is no other. Not all wounds hold us with equal force, and the pattern in which ones grip hardest reveals something about what we are really protecting. The wrongs the mind clings to most stubbornly are rarely the ones that cost us the most materially. They are the ones that threatened our sense of who we are, that struck at our identity, that seemed to say something unbearable about our worth, our lovability, our standing in the world. A wound to the self is held far longer than a wound to mere circumstance. The reason is that these wounds feel like a verdict, not just an injury, a betrayal that whispers you were never worth, being faithful to an exclusion that murmurs you do not belong, a cruelty that suggests you deserved it. These reach past the event, into the foundations of how we see ourselves, and the mind grips them tightly, because releasing them seems to mean accepting the verdict they delivered. We hold the wound to argue against what it seemed to say about us. This understanding points toward where the real work of forgiveness sometimes lies. It is not always about the offender at all, but about the verdict the offense seemed to pass on us, a verdict that was never true, that we have been silently fighting for years by refusing to let the wound go. To release such a wound is partly to stop believing the thing it seemed to say. The forgiveness in the end is as much of ourselves as of anyone, a quiet refusal to accept a sentence that was never just. One of the quieter surprises people report after forgiving is how unaware they had been of the holding itself. The grip had become so habitual, so woven into the background of their days, that they had stopped feeling it as effort, the way a hand clenched long enough forgets it is clenched. Only when the grievance is finally released do they notice the tension that was always there. The steady, low clutch they had mistaken for simply how things were. The relief reveals a burden they did not know they were carrying. This is part of why forgiveness can feel so unexpectedly large. The person was braced for the release of a known weight, and instead discovers that the weight was greater and more pervasive than they realized, that it had quietly shaped how they held their whole life. The grievance had become so familiar that it disappeared into the texture of ordinary existence, felt not as a separate burden, but as a permanent condition. And then it lifts, and the contrast is startling, the sudden ease throwing into relief just how much had been held. People often describe this moment with a kind of wonder, the recognition that they had been carrying far more than they ever consciously knew. Have you ever set something down and only then understood how heavy it had been? The grip we are least aware of is sometimes the one that has shaped us most, and forgiveness is how we finally feel our own hand unclench. There is a motive for forgiveness that has nothing to do with the offender at all, and it may be the steadiest of them. Some people forgive not because the one who wronged them deserves it, not because the offense was small, but because holding the grievance is incompatible with the person they want to be. The forgiveness is an act of self-definition, a choice about one's own character rather than a verdict on the offenders. They release the grudge to remain the kind of person they have decided to be, one who does not carry such weights. This motive has a particular durability because it does not depend on anything the offender does or fails to do. A forgiveness that waits for the offender to earn it can be held hostage forever by an offender who never will. But a forgiveness rooted in one's own values needs nothing from the other person at all. It stands on the forgiver's own ground. The question shifts entirely from "do they deserve to be forgiven" to "who do I want to be in the face of this?" That second question is one the forgiver can always answer, regardless of the offender's worth or repentance. There is a quiet strength in forgiving this way, in letting one's own chosen character rather than the offender's behavior decide the matter. The release becomes not a gift to someone who may not deserve it, but a way of staying true to oneself which no one else can ever take away. When people describe what forgiveness felt like across very different lives and very different wounds, the same word keeps surfacing unprompted and consistent. They reach for lightness. A lifting, an easing, a sense of weight removed, of suddenly carrying less of a heaviness they had grown used to simply gone. The word recurs so reliably across accounts that it seems to point at something real about the experience, a shared physical quality to the release that different people independently describe the same way. The consistency is itself revealing. If forgiveness were merely an abstract change of mind, we might expect people to describe it in abstract terms, in the language of decision or principle. Instead, they describe it bodily as a change in weight, as though the grievance had been a literal load, and the release a literal lightening. This matches everything the body tells us about a held grudge, the tension, the strain, the steady physical cost, and so its release would naturally be felt as that cost lifting, as the body finally setting down what it had been bracing to hold. The lightness is not a metaphor people happen to share by chance. It is in a sense an accurate report of what the body experiences when a long-carried burden is finally released. The word keeps appearing because the experience keeps being the same. Forgiveness is felt as lightness because that, quite literally, is what the easing of a long-held weight feels like from the inside. We tend to think of forgiveness as facing backward, a matter of how we regard something that already happened, a settling of accounts with the past. But the deeper truth is that forgiveness is mostly about the present, about who gets to determine the quality of this day, this hour, this moment, now unfolding. An unreleased grievance reaches forward out of the past to claim the present, dictating mood and attention in the here and now, letting an old event govern a present moment it has no business touching. Forgiveness is the reclaiming of that present. This reframing changes what forgiveness is for. It is not primarily about coming to terms with what happened, though it includes that. It is about refusing to let what happened keep governing what is happening now. The offense is over, finished, located firmly, in a time that has passed, and yet through the grievance it continues to exert force on a present it should have no claim on. To forgive is to cut that claim, to take back the present from the past's grip, to decide that this moment will be shaped by what is actually here rather than by what is long gone. There is real power in seeing it this way. The past cannot be changed. That is fixed forever. But the present is still open, still being shaped, and the question forgiveness answers is who gets to do the shaping. Hold the grievance, and the past keeps the pen. Release it, and the present is finally yours to write. Memory is not a vault that preserves the past unchanged. It is more like a story retold, and each retelling can subtly alter what is stored. An unforgiven wrong returned to again and again tends not to stay the size it was. It grows, gathering detail and weight, with each rehearsal accumulating significance and even false particulars it never originally had, until the remembered offense looms considerably larger than the actual event ever did. The grudge inflates the very thing it dwells on. This happens because every return to a grievance is also a revision of it, an opportunity for the mind to add interpretation to fill gaps, with assumption to lend the offense a coherence and a malice it may not have possessed in the unrehearsed moment. We are not simply remembering the wrong. We are quietly rewriting it, almost always in the direction of greater offense, building a case that grows stronger and more damning each time we present it to ourselves. The offender of memory becomes worse than the offender of fact. This is one of the hidden ways a grudge harms the one who holds it, by distorting the very record it claims to be preserving, magnifying the wound through the act of guarding it. Forgiveness, by ending the rehearsals, lets the memory settle back toward its actual size. The wrong stops growing once we stop feeding it, and the offense released often turns out to have been smaller than the grudge had made it. There is a fear that to let go of a wrong is to declare it unimportant, to say it did not matter, to diminish something that genuinely caused harm. Under that fear, holding on can feel like the only way to honor the reality of what happened, as if the grievance were a monument to the wrong's significance, and releasing it a kind of erasure. But letting go says nothing about whether the wrong mattered. It says only that the wrong no longer rules, no longer governs the one who suffered it. The significance of the offense and the grip it holds are two entirely separate things. A person can hold with complete conviction that what was done to them was serious, real, genuinely wrong, deserving of acknowledgement, and still release its rule over their present life. To let go is not to shrink the wrong to nothing. It is to stop letting it command. The wrong remains exactly as significant as it was. What changes is only its power over the one who carries it. This distinction frees people from a false loyalty, the sense that they owe it to the gravity of what happened to keep suffering it indefinitely. They owe no such thing. The wrong can be fully honored as real and serious in the very act of being released from rule. Honoring a wound and being ruled by it were never the same. The deepest acknowledgement of a wrong is not endless suffering under it, but the freedom to carry its truth without being commanded by its pain. Forgiveness does not always announce itself. Often there is no moment of release. A person can point to no felt decision, no clear turning. Instead, the discovery comes sideways, and after the fact, when a person stumbles across the old wound in some ordinary moment and notices with mild surprise that it no longer stings, that the familiar sharpness simply is not there anymore. They learn they have forgiven not by an act they remember performing, but by the quiet absence of a pain they expected to feel. The forgiveness completed itself without ceremony, and they find out only by its result. There is something gentle in this, and reassuring for anyone who has tried to forgive and felt nothing change. The work does not always happen where we can watch it. A grievance can be quietly dissolving over weeks and months beneath conscious notice, the way a wound heals without our attending to it, until one day we reach for the old pain out of habit and find it has gone. The absence is the evidence. We did not feel ourselves forgive, and yet here is the proof that we did, in the simple fact that the wound no longer answers when touched. Have you ever returned to an old hurt expecting it to flare and found it had quietly gone quiet? That quiet is forgiveness discovered after the fact, having done its work in the dark while we were busy living. Sometimes we are the last to know that we have already let something go. We tend to imagine forgiveness as total and all or nothing act, either fully accomplished or not real at all. Under that view, a partial forgiveness can seem like a failure, an incomplete job, evidence that one has not truly let go. But forgiveness is not bound to be complete to be genuine. It can be partial, a loosening of the grip rather than a full release, a reduction of the grievance rather than its disappearance. And even this partial easing brings real relief, real lightening, real benefit to the one who manages it. A grudge held a little less tightly already weighs a little less. This matters because the demand for total forgiveness can become an obstacle to any forgiveness at all. A person who believes they must achieve a complete and final release, a perfect letting go with no trace of resentment remaining, may give up entirely when they cannot reach that standard, concluding that anything less is worthless. But the standard was never required. Loosening a grip even partway returns some of the energy, eases some of the tension, lifts some of the weight, and those partial gains are real and worth having. Forgiveness can be a gradual unclenching, rather than a single complete release, each degree of letting go bringing its own measure of relief. You do not have to forgive perfectly to forgive beneficially. The partial release is not a failed version of the real thing. It is the real thing in the amount you are able to offer, and it helps in exactly the proportion that you manage it. People are often discouraged to find that the resentment they thought they had released comes back, the old feeling rising again weeks or months after they believed they had forgiven, and they take its return as proof that the forgiveness failed. But forgiveness is not a single act performed once and finished forever. It is a choice that renews available again each time the old feeling returns. To be made fresh in each new moment, the grievance resurfaces. The return of the resentment is not a failure of the forgiveness. It is simply another occasion to choose it again. This understanding relieves an enormous and needless burden. The person who believes forgiveness must be permanent the first time will read every resurgence of anger as evidence of their own failure, and may abandon the effort entirely in discouragement. But no one forgives a deep wound once and is done. The feeling returns, as feelings do, and the work is to meet it with the same choice each time, gently, without judging oneself for its return. Over many such renewals, the resentment genuinely weakens the choosing, becoming easier and the feeling fainter, until eventually it may stop returning at all. But that is the result of the renewals, not a precondition for them. Forgiveness is less a single door we pass through than a direction we keep choosing again and again each time the old pull reasserts itself. The return of the feeling is not the end of forgiveness. It is simply the next invitation to forgive. Consider the cases where forgiveness might seem impossible, where the usual conditions for it are entirely absent. The offender who has died beyond any reach, the one who has vanished, gone without a trace, the one who remains entirely unrepentant, who would refuse the forgiveness if offered and deny any wrong was done. By the common picture of forgiveness as something exchanged between two parties, these cases ought to be hopeless. And yet people forgive in exactly these circumstances, fully and with real release, which proves something fundamental about what forgiveness actually is. The act needs no audience, no recipient, no participation from the offender at all. This is perhaps the clearest possible demonstration that forgiveness lives entirely within the one who offers it. If a person can forgive someone long dead, someone who will never know, someone who would reject the forgiveness outright, then forgiveness was never a transaction requiring the offender's involvement. The whole of it, beginning to end, happens inside the forgiver. The offender's death, absence, or refusal changes nothing about the forgiver's capacity to release, because the release was never theirs to grant or withhold. There is a deep liberation in grasping this fully. It means no one can ever prevent you from forgiving. No offender can hold your freedom hostage by dying or disappearing or refusing to repent. The door to release is on your side of the wall always, and it opens whether or not anyone stands on the other side. The act needs no audience, because the act was always only yours. There is a particular time of day when an unreleased grievance tends to make itself most felt, and most people who carry one know it well. Not in the busy daylight when the world's demands keep the mind occupied, but in the quiet hours before sleep, when the distractions fall away and the mind is left alone with what it has been holding. In that stillness, the old grudge surfaces, replays, gathers weight, and a person who managed to keep it at bay all day finds it waiting for them in the dark. The night is when the held wound speaks loudest. The reason is partly that the grievance needs stillness to be heard, and the day rarely offers any. Busyness is a kind of muffling. It does not release the grudge, but only drowns it out, leaving it intact to resurface the moment the noise stops. And so the wound returns, precisely when a person most needs rest in the threshold, before sleep turning what should be a settling into a rehearsal of old pain. This is part of why the unforgiving so often sleep poorly, the grievance claiming exactly the hours meant for letting go. There is a quiet argument for forgiveness, hidden in this nightly pattern. The grudge we carry does not trouble us evenly. It waits for our most vulnerable hours, the ones meant for rest, and takes them. To release it is, among other things, to reclaim the night, to let the quiet before sleep become a settling again, rather than a return to an old wound that will not stay buried. A held grievance does something subtle to a person's sense of time, and the effect is easy to miss. By keeping the mind anchored to a past event, the grudge narrows the future, shrinking the horizon to the dimensions of the old wound, so that tomorrow is shaped less by possibility than by the reach of yesterday's harm. The person bound to a grievance lives in a future that the past has already partly written. And so when the grievance is released, something opens. People who forgive often describe a widening of their sense of what is possible, a future that suddenly seems larger, less determined by what came before. The horizon expands. This makes sense once you see how much of the future a grudge quietly occupies. The grievance does not stay in the past where it belongs. It projects forward, coloring expectations, narrowing what a person believes they can become, holding the future hostage to the shape of an old hurt. To release it is to release the future as well. To let tomorrow be open, rather than predetermined by an injury that should have stayed behind. There is something hopeful in this widening. Forgiveness is not only a settling of accounts with the past, it is an enlargement of what lies ahead. A return of possibilities the grudge had quietly foreclosed. The person who lets go of an old wound is not only lighter, they are, in a real sense, freer to become something the grievance would never have allowed. Among the many ways people describe the aftermath of forgiveness, one is especially telling. They say they feel themselves more fully who they were, as though some part of them that the grievance had occupied has been returned to them. The grudge, it seems, had been holding ground that belonged to the person taking up space in their identity, and its release gives that ground back. They become more themselves by becoming less their grievance. This points to how thoroughly a long-held resentment can colonize a person, becoming not just something they carry, but something they partly are, a defining feature, a fixed part of how they think of themselves. The wounded person can come to wear the wound as identity, the grievance growing into a piece of who they understand themselves to be, until releasing it feels almost like losing a part of the self. But the opposite turns out to be true. The grievance was never the self. It was an occupier of the self, ground, borrowed and held by an old wound. And so its release does not diminish the person, but restores them, hands back the territory the grudge had claimed, lets them be more fully who they were underneath it all along. There is a quiet recovery in this. To forgive is partly to reclaim oneself, to take back the part of one's own identity that the grievance had quietly annexed. People feel more themselves after forgiving, because they are, the self made whole again by the return of ground it had not realized it had lost. Beneath the desire for revenge, which tends to fade once examined, there often lies a quieter and more persistent longing, one that survives long after the appetite for punishment is gone. It is the wish to be understood by the very person who caused the harm, to have them finally grasp what they did, to see the wound from the inside and know the weight of it. This longing for the offender's understanding can outlast every other feeling attached to the wound, persisting quietly for years after the anger itself has cooled. We stop wanting them punished long before we stop wanting them to understand. This is one of the subtler obstacles to forgiveness, because it is so much gentler than rage that we may not recognize it as something still binding us. The wish to be understood feels reasonable, even noble, nothing like the cruder hunger for revenge, and so we hold it without noticing that it too keeps us tethered, keeps us waiting on the offender, keeps a part of our peace contingent on a comprehension they may never reach. The understanding we long for may simply not be available. The person who caused the harm may lack the capacity, or the willingness, or the awareness ever to grasp what they did. And so part of forgiveness sometimes is releasing not the wish for revenge, but this quieter wish to be understood, accepting that the comprehension we longed for may never come, and choosing to be free anyway. The longing was real, but our freedom cannot wait on it forever. Here is the strange economy at the heart of forgiveness, the asymmetry that defines it. Forgiveness demands nothing, whatever, from the offender. It does not require their apology, their understanding, their repentance, their participation, or even their awareness that anything has occurred. And yet, asking nothing of them, it gives everything back to the one who offers it, returning the peace. The attention, the energy, the future that the grievance had quietly held. All the cost falls on the grudge. All the gain returns to the forgiver. This is what makes forgiveness so unlike the transactions we are used to. In most exchanges, what one party gains another must give, and the benefit depends on the cooperation of both. Forgiveness breaks that rule entirely. The offender contributes nothing, and yet the forgiver receives everything, because what is being returned was never the offender's to give in the first place. It was the forgiver's own peace held captive by the grievance, and the offender's involvement was never required to release it. There is a profound freedom in understanding this fully. It means the entire benefit of forgiveness sits within the forgiver's reach at all times, requiring no permission, no participation, no change of heart from anyone else. The one who wronged you need do nothing, and you may still recover everything. The grievance asked you to wait on the offender for your release. Forgiveness reveals that you never needed them at all. Everything it returns was always yours. There is a false choice that traps many people seeking to forgive themselves, the belief that they must choose between being kind to themselves and holding themselves accountable, as though compassion and responsibility could not occupy the same heart. Under that belief, self-compassion looks like an evasion of accountability, and accountability looks like a refusal of compassion, and a person caught between them can find no way forward at all. But the two are not opposed. A person can hold genuine compassion for themselves and full accountability for their wrong at the same time, and healthy self-forgiveness requires both together. The compassion does not cancel the accountability. It makes the accountability survivable. This pairing is what allows a person to look squarely at what they did without being destroyed by the looking. Compassion alone without accountability slides into excuse, a refusal to face the wrong honestly. Accountability alone, without compassion, collapses into the crushing self-condemnation that drives a person into denial. Only together do they work. The accountability keeping the person honest about the harm, the compassion keeping them whole enough to bear that honesty. To forgive yourself well is not to choose between owning the wrong and being gentle with yourself. It is to do both at once, holding the fault clearly while holding yourself kindly. The two are not in tension, they are partners. The hand that holds you to account and the hand that holds you with mercy can be the same hand, and in true self-forgiveness they must be. A grudge often presents itself as a kind of guardian, a way of staying alert to a danger of keeping the wound's lesson sharp, so that we are never caught off guard the same way again. Under that promise, holding the grievance feels like wisdom, like protection, like a sensible refusal to lower our defenses against a proven threat. The grudge tells us that as long as we keep it, we are safe. But it is a promise the grudge cannot actually keep. The protection a grievance offers is largely illusory, because the alertness it maintains is not the kind that actually guards us. It is a fixation on the past that does little to defend us against the future, while exacting a continuous cost in the present. The wound's genuine lesson, the real wisdom about what to watch for, can be kept entirely without the grudge, held as clear knowledge rather than as live resentment. What the grudge adds to that wisdom is not protection, but pain, a perpetual reopening of the injury that guards against nothing. We can be fully forewarned and fully released at the same time. The caution does not require the grievance to enforce it. This is the quiet lie at the center of many grudges, that the suffering they impose is the price of safety, when in truth the safety could be had without the suffering at all. The grudge promises to protect us and delivers only the cost. The actual protection, the kept lesson, was always available without it. People waiting to feel forgiving before they forgive may wait a very long time because forgiveness does not usually begin as a feeling. It begins far more often as a decision, a choice made deliberately while the old resentment is still fully present, a commitment to release that precedes any felt sense of release. The feeling, when it comes afterward, catching up to the decision sometimes long after it was made. Forgiveness is chosen first and felt later, not the other way around. This reverses what most people expect, and the expectation traps them. They wait for the resentment to soften on its own, for some natural arrival of forgiving feeling that will signal they are ready, and the feeling never comes because feelings rarely move first. It is the decision that moves first, the deliberate choice to release made in the presence of feelings that have not yet changed, and it is that choice which eventually draws the feeling along behind it. A person can decide to forgive while still angry, still hurt, still feeling nothing forgiving at all, and the decision is no less real for the lag. The feeling will follow in its own time, gradually catching up to the stance the will has already taken. Understanding this frees a person to begin before they feel ready to forgive as an act, rather than wait for it as an emotion. You do not have to feel forgiving to forgive. You have only to decide and let the feeling find its way to you afterward, as it reliably does. At the root of much suffering over an old wrong lies a demand we rarely state plainly but hold with great force, the demand that the past have been other than it was, that the harm not have happened, that things have gone differently than they did. We argue with what occurred, refusing on some level to accept it, holding out against a reality that cannot be changed. And much of the pain of a grievance comes precisely from this refusal, this ongoing insistence that the unchangeable past should somehow not have been what it was. To forgive, in large part, is to lay down that demand. It is to stop insisting that what happened should not have happened, to release the argument with a past that will never yield to it, to accept, finally, that things were as they were and cannot now be otherwise. This is not approval of the wrong. It is acceptance of the fact of it, a different thing entirely. The demand that the past be different is a demand that can never be met, and holding it is a form of self-torment, a continual collision with an immovable reality. The past is the one thing in all of existence that is utterly fixed, beyond any reach of will or wish, and to keep demanding its revision is to guarantee one's own suffering. Forgiveness ends that collision. It does not make the wrong acceptable. It makes the fact of it acceptable, which is the only way to stop bleeding against it. To forgive is to make peace with what cannot be changed, and so to stop being wounded again and again by reality's refusal to be other than it is. We often locate the resolution of a wound in the offender, imagining that our peace will arrive when they finally change, apologize, understand, become the person who would never have hurt us. And so we wait, holding our own relief in suspension, contingent on a transformation in someone else that we cannot cause and may never see. But the relief, when it comes from a different source entirely. It arrives not when the offender changes, but when the forgiver stops waiting for them to, when they release the contingency and reclaim a peace that no longer depends on anyone else's transformation. The freedom is in the ending of the wait, not in the awaited thing. This is a hard reorientation because the wait feels so reasonable, so justified. Surely we are owed the change, the apology, the understanding, and surely it makes sense to hold out for what we are owed. But the holding out is itself the prison, the act that keeps our peace forever in someone else's hands, dependent on a debtor who may never pay. To stop waiting is not to forgive the debt as small. It is to stop letting our own freedom hang on its collection. The offender may never change, and if our relief requires their change, we have handed them an indefinite veto over our peace. Forgiveness takes that veto back. It locates the relief where it can actually be reached, in our own ceasing to wait, rather than in a transformation we cannot compel. The offender need not change at all. We need only stop waiting. And the relief we were holding for them turns out to have been ours to claim all along. Every life accumulates a history, and within that history, there are usually a few moments of real harm, wounds given or received that loom larger than the rest. The danger is that one of these moments can come to define a person, to stand in for the whole of who they are, until a single worst event eclipses an entire life that contains so much more. The wound becomes the headline, and everything else recedes into its shadow. Forgiveness changes this. It lets a person carry the full history, the worst moment included, without that moment being permitted to define them, restoring the wound to its actual place as one event among many, rather than the sum of the whole. The history remains. Its tyranny ends. This applies in both directions to wounds suffered and wounds caused. A person defined by what was done to them lives forever, inside their worst day, the victim of a single event grown to fill their whole identity. A person defined by what they did lives forever, inside their worst act, unable to be anything beyond their gravest failure. Forgiveness of others and of oneself releases both from this captivity, allowing the worst moment to be carried as part of a larger life, rather than mistaken for the entirety of it. We are none of us reducible to our most painful hour, whether we suffered it or caused it. Forgiveness is what lets the rest of the life count, what keeps a single moment, however terrible, from being allowed to speak for the whole. The freedom that forgiveness brings does not announce itself loudly. There is no fanfare, no dramatic moment, no obvious sign that something significant has changed. It is a quiet freedom, easy to overlook, the kind of thing a person might not notice for some time, registering only gradually as an absence, a lightness, a thing that used to be there and somehow is not. And yet, quiet as it is unmistakable once it has truly arrived, recognized with a certainty that needs no confirmation. You know it when you have it, even though it slipped in without a sound. This quietness is fitting because forgiveness itself is quiet, an internal act that leaves no visible trace, and so its fruit is quiet too, felt rather than displayed. The person who has forgiven does not feel triumphant or transformed in any dramatic way. They simply feel at some point that a weight they carried is no longer there, that a place in them that used to ache has gone still. The freedom is in the stillness, in the absence of a familiar pain, in the quiet that has replaced a long noise. It is the kind of freedom one might not be able to point to or prove, and yet there is no doubt of it once it is present. The loudness was all in the grievance. The freedom that follows is silent, and in that silence, complete. It is easy to miss, precisely because it is the absence of something, and unmistakable because the absence is exactly what one has longed for all along. Some debts can be settled. A wrong can sometimes be made right, a harm repaired, a balance restored, and in those cases, the demand for repayment is reasonable and may even be met. But many of the wrongs that wound us most deeply create debts that can never truly be paid, harms for which no compensation is possible, losses that no apology or restitution can actually restore. To hold out for the payment of such a debt is to wait forever, to stake one's present on a settlement that will never come. Forgiveness is the choice to stop waiting to release the unpayable debt, not because it was small, but because collecting it is impossible, and to choose the present over an endless and futile wait. We choose what is here over what can never be made right. This is perhaps the most clear-eyed reason to forgive an irreparable wrong. It is not that the wrong did not matter, or that the debt was not real. It is that the debt genuinely cannot be paid, and to organize a life around collecting it is to forfeit the life in pursuit of the impossible. The present is real and available. The repayment is neither. To keep demanding the unpayable is to trade something we can actually have, the present moment and all it offers, for something we can never receive, a settlement of accounts that the nature of the wrong forbids. Forgiveness makes the wiser trade. It lets go of the debt that cannot be paid in order to keep the present that can actually be lived. We choose the life that is here over the payment that will never come, and in that choice, we are finally free to live it. We sometimes imagine that the peace forgiveness brings must involve a kind of forgetting, that to be at peace with a wrong, we must somehow lose the memory of it, let it fade until it no longer troubles us because it is no longer there. But the peace of forgiveness is not built on forgetting. The memory remains often in full detail, the event entirely intact in recollection. What changes is not the presence of the memory, but the sting that used to come with it, the sharp emotional charge that once arrived the moment the memory surfaced. The peace lies in the memory's loss of its sting, not in the memory's loss itself. This is a more durable peace than forgetting could ever provide, and a more honest one. A peace that depended on forgetting would be fragile, undone the moment the memory returned, and it would require a kind of self-deception, a willed blindness to one's own past. The peace of forgiveness asks for no such thing. It allows the memory to remain, to be recalled clearly and without distortion, and simply removes the pain that used to accompany it, so that a person can remember exactly what happened and feel when they do. Not the old ache, but something closer to stillness. The wound is remembered without being relived. This is what people mean when they say they have made peace with something. Not that they have erased it, but that they can hold it now, without being hurt by the holding. The memory stays. Only the sting departs, and in its departure peace arrives. Looking back across their lives, people tend to hold remarkably few regrets about having forgiven. The release once accomplished almost never becomes something they wish they had withheld. Forgiveness, in retrospect, rarely disappoints the one who offered it. But there is one regret that surfaces again and again in these backward glances, and it is not the regret of having forgiven. It is the regret of having waited so long to do it, of the years spent carrying a grievance that could have been set down so much earlier, of the time lost to a holding that brought nothing. People do not regret forgiving. They regret how long they took to begin. This pattern is worth sitting with, because it speaks directly to anyone currently holding a grievance they have not yet released. The fear that forgiving will be a mistake, that one will look back and wish the grudge had been kept, turns out to be almost entirely unfounded. That regret rarely comes. The regret that does come reliably and across many lives runs the other way, mourning not the forgiveness, but the delay, the wasted years of carrying what could have been released long before. If the people who have walked this path almost never regret the forgiving, and so often regret the waiting, the lesson for anyone still holding on seems clear enough. The release that you fear you might regret is the one you will almost certainly be glad of. The only thing you are likely to wish looking back is that you had not waited so long to let it go. Throughout all of this, one cost has run beneath the others, quiet and continuous, and rarely counted. A grudge spends attention. It draws day after day on the limited supply of focus a person has, pulling it toward the old wound, the rehearsed offense, the maintained case against the offender, and all of that attention is attention not available for anything else. The grievance is a steady expenditure, a withdrawal made so regularly that the person stops noticing the account is being drained. Forgiveness ends the spending. It returns to the forgiver all the attention the grudge had quietly been consuming, hands back a resource they did not fully realize they had been losing. And attention in the end may be the most precious resource we have, because attention is where life actually happens, where we meet the people before us and the moments as they come. A grudge spends that resource on the past, on a person often no longer present, on an event already, overleaving less of it for the living present. That is the only place anything can actually be enjoyed or done. To release the grievance is to recover the attention, to take back the focus that was leaking continuously into an old wound and return it to a life that needs it. People who forgive often describe feeling more present afterward, more able to attend to what is actually in front of them. And this is why the attention the grudge was spending has come home. Forgiveness is among everything else. It is a recovery of attention, a reclaiming of the one resource that determines more than any other how fully a person gets to live. There is a fear that letting go of a wrong means losing the story of it, surrendering the account of what happened, erasing a chapter of one's own life. Under that fear, holding on can feel like the only way to keep the story, as though releasing the grievance would mean releasing the history, along with it leaving a blank where a real and formative experience used to be. But letting go does not lose the story. The The story remains entirely available, to be told, understood, learned from, integrated into the fuller account of a life. What changes is only that the person is no longer held inside it, no longer trapped within the wound as though it was still happening, no longer living within the story rather than carrying it. We keep the story. We simply step out of it. This is the difference between having a history and being imprisoned by it. A person who has let go of a wound still possesses the full narrative of what occurred. They can recount it, reflect on it, draw its lessons, hold it as part of who they have become. But they are looking at it now from outside, from the vantage of someone for whom it is past, rather than from inside where it would continue to feel present and inescapable. The grievance held them within the story, made them a permanent character in an event that should have ended. Forgiveness lets them close the book and set it on the shelf, not destroyed, not forgotten, simply finished a story they carry rather than a place they live. To let go is to keep the whole of the story and to be at last free of it. There is a layer of forgiveness that lies beneath even the forgiveness of the offender, and it is often the one most quietly in need of attention. Beneath the anger at the one who caused the harm, there frequently runs a subtler current of judgment aimed at oneself, at the self who endured the wrong, who did not see it coming, who did not prevent it, who responded imperfectly, who survived it in ways one later second guesses. And so the deepest forgiveness often includes this self, the one who went through the wound without knowing how, who did the best they could in a situation they were not prepared for, and who has been quietly blamed ever since for not having managed it better. We forgive the offender and find there is still someone left to forgive ourselves for having been wounded. This self-forgiveness is easy to overlook because the judgment is so quiet, so woven into the background, that it hardly registers as judgment at all, more a low and constant sense of having somehow failed in the moment of being harmed. But it is there, in the person who berates themselves for having trusted, for not having seen, for having frozen or fled, or stayed too long, for having been in short human and unprepared in the face of harm. The deepest forgiveness reaches this person and releases them too, extending to the self who endured the wrong, the same mercy extended to the one who caused it. They were doing the best they could with what they had. To forgive them finally is to complete the release, to let go not only of the offender but of the long, quiet blame aimed at the one who simply had to live through it. We have traced forgiveness through the body and the mind, through memory and time, through the offender and the self. And beneath all of it lies a single simple image that may capture it best. To carry a grievance is to carry a weight, and to carry it for years is to carry that weight too far, long past the point where carrying it served any purpose, past exhaustion, past the place where setting it down became not a defeat but a mercy. Forgiveness, in the end, is the setting down. It is the moment a person finally lowers a burden they have hauled too long over too great a distance, and feels in the lowering the simple relief of no longer holding what they were never meant to hold forever. The image is humble, and that is fitting, because forgiveness is finally a humble act, not a grand moral achievement, but a plain and human one, the act of a tired person setting down a load that had grown too heavy. There is no shame in having carried it. The carrying was understandable, even necessary for a time. But there comes a point where the carrying has gone on too far, where the weight is doing nothing but wearing down the one who bears it, and at that point, the wisest and kindest thing is simply to set it down. Forgiveness is that setting down. It is permission, finally, to stop carrying what you have carried too long, to lower the weight, to rest your arms, to walk on unburdened. You were never required to carry it forever. You are allowed, at last, to set it down. We come at the last to the quiet heart of the whole matter. Through all of this we have spoken of forgiveness as something done toward the offender, a release extended to the one who caused the harm. But the deepest truth turns that picture inside out. What is actually released in forgiveness was never the offender at all. The offender in most cases was never being held by the grievance. They were free the whole time, often unaware. What was being held all along was something within the forgiver, a tension, a bracing, a long withheld breath the forgiver had been holding since the wound first landed and had never quite let go. Forgiveness is the release of that breath. Think of how a person holds their breath against a shock, against a pain, against a moment too much to bear, and how the breath can stay held unconsciously long after the moment has passed, the body bracing against a blow that already fell. A grievance is a breath held against an old wound, a bracing that outlived its cause by years, and the forgiver has been holding it so long they no longer feel themselves holding it. Forgiveness is the exhale. It is the moment the held breath finally releases. The long bracing finally eases the body, and the mind finally let go of a tension they had carried since the wound first came. The offender was never the one being held. It was always the forgiver's own breath held too long, waiting all this time to be let go. And so we arrive where we began, at the quiet recognition that forgiveness was never truly about the other person. It was about the one doing the forgiving all along. We carry our wounds, believing we hold them against those who caused them, and we discover when we finally set them down that the only one we were ever holding was ourselves. The grievance bound us, not them. The waiting cost us, not them. The breath was ours, held against a moment long past, and ours to release whenever we were ready. Letting go does not erase what happened, does not declare the wrong acceptable, does not require forgetting or reconciliation or the offender's participation in any way. It asks only that we stop carrying what we were never meant to carry forever, that we set down the weight, that we let the long-held breath finally go, and in that release, quiet and easy to miss and unmistakable once it arrives, we find that the freedom we were seeking was never in the offender's hands at all. It was in our own the whole time, waiting for us to open them. To forgive is to set ourselves free. Thank you for spending this time here with me. Good night.